Today we have in the show the amazing Ann Nocenti, which was the editor of most X-Men comics from 1985 to like almost 1990, and wrote some of her own like Longshot and Beauty and the Beast, and some New Mutants issues here and there, and some classic X-Men too, and who also is an amazing journalist and filmmaker. And she recently uh, had two books come out written by her. One is The Seeds with
Yes.
David Haha, and the other is Ruby Falls with Flavia Biondi. And and also like her incredible Daredevil run, which a lot of you that we're watching will be seeing. So we're gonna talk a little bit here and there about all of these things in the capacity that Anne wants to tell us about them. So let's go with the show.
This week on Mutant Watch.
So here we are. So for starters, and for getting into some point on here, well, the first thing that I wanted to ask you more, because dropping from my own experience, one of the first comics I read, and most likely the one that first got into my heart, was New Mutants 25, which you edited, and on these comics, on this era specifically of the X-Men, was when we have talked in the show about this before the franchise started becoming a franchise, started like having events and having those cute little books in the sides like Fallen Angels and Firestar, and like things that wouldn't normally be like working because they're not exactly about shiny superheroes, but they're more about people, a lot of them about people struggling with everyday things, but they're mutants, or they're, with a twist. And that also answered the career of Dazzler, and like created a whole like mythology of the X-Men that is what I feel like people understand first when they feel the X-Men, and that's what you and Louis Simonson and Chris Claremont created in that era. So I just want to ask you, how was that? How was coming up with these ideas that at the time must feel like really strange and not in the like realm of mastering comics?
Well, I think that the 80s Marvel, to put it in a context, I was at Marvel for most of the 80s, 1980s, and I was just a kid. I had just graduated college with an art portfolio, and I still draw and paint. And when I landed at Marvel, 1980s New York City was very, it wasn't a fancy city. It was a very there was a lot of crime. The city was kind of in an economic collapse, but there was a huge art scene. There was a lot of graffiti artists and performance artists, and CBGBs had all the punk bands. And I was part of the sort of downtown art scene. And so when I got the job at Marvel, I didn't know that much about comics. I just thought they were cool, because I wrote and drew, and this was a job that put words and pictures together. And I was also a student of film. So for me, it was just kind of a natural thing. And I think that the bullpen comics back then, I should have grabbed some original art from my closet, but the comics back then were made by hand. And so I did paste up and mechanicals, and I imagine none of you know what that is, but they used to, the letterer would letter the comic, and then they'd do a stat of it, and you'd have to, use your X-Acto knife and cut out around the balloons and bubbles and get your paint pot and stick it on the boards. And there was people used to, like, we just all pitched in. I did coloring, I did some inking, you know, just filling in. And the bullpen had these spectacular cast of characters. It had Marie Severin, who was like a god to me, you know, and she was wild. And you had John Romita Sr. Was running the Romita Raiders. And so I landed in an incredible place. I mean, it was just really just luck. And you progressed. Everybody wrote or drew. If you were an editor, you were supposed to know how to make comics. It's weird now that editors don't necessarily know how to make comics because, you know, I that was so much a part of the job that you'd be able to pitch in and help put the comic together to get it out. And then working with Louise Jones, she basically, sometimes I like to call myself a clone of Louise Jones. We called her Wheezy, Louise Simonson, because we had Chris Claremont, who was an endless, you know, he was like a cauldron of ideas. He just would sit there and say, what about this? What about this? What if we turn them inside out? What if we send them to hell? What if we fracture reality? What if we, you know, and he would just go on and on. And Wheezy taught me, Wheezy was Louise Simonson, Louise Jones's nickname. She just taught me how to kind of like let Chris open the floodgates, take him to lunch a lot, feed him, and then just sort of help him chart and map out his incredible. His comics were operatic, but they were soap operas. So they were like operatic soap operas. And one of the things that now everybody talks about diversity in comics, but I landed in a job working with Wheezy and Chris, where Chris had these empowered women that influenced him, in real empowered women in his life. He talks about his mother and I think his aunt, and he just naturally had a diversity empowered female, you know, bent. That's who he was. And in fact, sometimes I'd be like, we're kind of forgetting about Cyclops and Colossus. They're getting kind of boring. And he would be like, no, I want to write another Storm story, you know. He was always wanting to do more with the women. And I mean, he was extremely respectful. And so I think that even though we didn't know it at the time, though the whole, of course, metaphor for the outsider, the mutant, you know, hit a touchstone, hit something in everyone's lives. And it's pretty startling to see 30 years later, maybe 35 years later, that people still love these early X-Men and New Mutant stories. And the New Mutants especially, I had a moment with Chris Claremont, and we had been talking to Bill Sienkiewicz, and Bill Sienkiewicz was getting off of Moon Knight, where he was doing his thing where it was very influenced by Neil Adams. You know, he was doing those like elongated limb shots, and he really wanted to find his own voice artistically. And Bill and me and Chris used to have these long talks, and I remember one time Bill brought in Ralph Steadman. You know, Hunter Thompson used to work with Ralph Steadman, and there were these Ralph Steadman drawings with these like googly eyes, and it was just gonzo journalism meets gonzo artist. And Bill was like, I want to do this in a comic. And so, you know, we put him on the New Mutants, and when you have an artist like that, and I'll have to say that, you know, working with David Aja on the Seeds is a similar thing. When you have an artist that you know can make magic, you tend to like just go wild, because we wanted to see. I think we created Warlock and Legion because Bill was drawing the book. We were kind of like, Bill could do this, So yeah, it was a very explosive, creative time. And, I was very lucky because the industry wasn't corporate yet. It wasn't popular. There was no IP, valuable IP. There were no movies. This is all pre-internet. So it was more like a garage band sensibility. I mean, when I think about me and Arthur Adams coming up with Longshot and Spiral and Mojo, I like to think of us as like, it was very similar to the punk bands I was seeing in CBGB's. Oh yeah, there it is. When you get up on stage, you didn't know how to sing, you didn't know how to play your guitar, but you got up on stage and did it anyway. And that was like, me and Arthur were kind of like, we don't know what we're doing, but they're letting us get up on stage. So we just kind of ran with that.
So one thing I think those issues of Longshot and also New Mutants have in common is like the themes that this book explored were not like classical superhero stuff. They were like existential stuff, and you were drawing from movies, and you were drawing from New Mutants especially is talking a lot about trauma and about how all these characters got together and like try to survive what was going with them. And it was like not your classical like superhero like do the right thing and stuff, but it was more like about how they survive and how they form bonds with each other and come with their identities, which is what I think touched a lot of people. It's definitely what touched me. And I don't know, I just want to ask, where does that come from? Where does those themes that seem more overarching?
I think that Chris and I were very different writers, and it's sort of hard for me to talk about that time without talking about Wheezy, Chris, and me, because like Wheezy was a magnificent storyteller, and she had a tenderness to her that was just, and a spirit. And so when she created Power Pack, she was like trying to reach an audience that no one was trying to reach yet at Marvel. And Chris was going as deep as he could into like the feelings of the characters, like Rain and Cannonball, and of course, all the X-Men. He was always trying to dig deep in the characters and then do a sort of like Shakespearean epic where he would have the feelings of the characters against this startling opera. And I must admit, none of those things, I couldn't do any of those things. I wasn't like a deep feeling. I didn't put deep feelings in my comics. I didn't do opera. I didn't do what Wheezy did, which was kind of like a tender, her stuff was full of empathy. I think I was just sort of doing something different because when you mentioned Beauty and the Beast, I remember that one of the central things in that was like the idea that of a misfit family, of like, maybe you felt like you were born into the wrong family, you were an alien in your own family, and so you had to find your people. And I think there was, what was it called, like the Heartbreak Hotel or something? There was some kind of a group of kids that were like misfitty. And I think also I was uncomfortable, and I've talked about this before, about I was uncomfortable with the narrative that everything had to escalate into a fight. And so I think whereas Chris and Wheezy seemed to embrace orchestrating fights, I had a hard time getting there because I was like, well, can't we just be peace negotiators? Do we have to fight? So it became, I had to think about what's behind the fist. Like, if somebody's going to punch somebody, it can't just be some kind of meet cute, where like, oh, look, it's the Hulk, let's attack him, So I think I started putting like social issues into comics so that I could figure out what can you put behind a fist that makes sense, that you'd want to punch somebody. So I think like my early Daredevil stories were definitely more about the villain than about Daredevil. And it took me a long time. I did a bunch of issues that were just like weird villain, weird villain, weird villain. And then finally with John Romita Jr., I was able to say, okay, this is who Daredevil is. This is who Matt Murdock is. Let me create a villain that he can fight with, which was Typhoid Mary, where somehow I could integrate the fight into who he was. And, you know, so it's a complicated process to write comics, you know, to put yourself in the comic, to figure out why is everyone fighting. And I think it's interesting now for me because I'm working with Karen Berger, who, as we know over at Vertigo Books, she was a master at helping people find their voice and letting them have their voice. You know, I don't know if, I mean, just all the sensibilities she brought into like an indie style inside a superhero house. And so for me right now, Karen giving me the ability to do Ruby Falls with Flavia Biondi, who's an Italian artist. You know, it's a noir mystery, but it's really about 3 generations of women. And I learn a lot from the artists. Like Flavia she can act. She inhabits the drawings, finds a body language and gestures for each character that makes them like ground them in a way that is just so empathic. And then David Aja, of course, he's a master, you know, and so you can, I was thinking about this the other day, you can give David Aja, like there's a scene, one of my favorite scenes is there's a farmer who has a moment when he realizes, you know, he actually loves his pig. His pig has given him so many piglets that he's made his living from, that he has a moment when he wonders, should he kill his pig? And, you know, David made that moment just transcendent. And, oh, wow, yes, there it is. And he can turn anything into something so magical and deep that, you know, for me, it's all about the artist. And I'm drawing now. I'm spending a lot of time drawing because drawing is how I find a story. Like I won't draw the comic, but I find the story by doing drawings. So right now I'm doing a bunch of drawings. Now, am I supposed to stay on topic talking about mutants, I guess, for Mutant Watch?
You're fine. Like this is a gift.
Here at Mutant Watch, we like to just wander and meander through our topics. We eventually get back somewhere.
Well, you can also like steer me like a sheepdog herding the sheep. You know, you can say, "Hey, I want to get her to talk about this or that." You know, I mean,
we're on your time.
Mutants are interesting. Somebody, now I'm going to blank on who it was. Maybe it was one of you. Someone sent me a little essay they wrote about Typhoid Mary, and it was such a wonderful little essay. It's on Twitter. I'd have to find it for you. But it was like she or he, I don't even know who it was, really understood typhoid. Was it somebody here?
Yeah, it was me.
It was Travis.
Mine.
Oh, wow. That was such a great piece. And I think, didn't you even bring up that somebody came along and turned her into a mutant and kind of like missed the whole point?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was really a beautiful way of looking at her. And I do sort of remember that people have said, yeah, well, isn't Typhoid a mutant? And I'm like, no, why would she be a mutant? It's like, you know. But I mean, it's sort of like if the word mutant embraces the other, then you could say that is something like David Aha and I definitely wanted the love affair between the alien and human to be, without ever saying it, about loving the other. And so that otherness thing is there, I guess, in a lot of my work. But yeah, that was a terrific essay. I really did agree with you that they missed the point, whoever that was. I don't know who wrote that story.
So since you talk about the seeds, and I guess we can talk about that book now. It's a book that she has with David Aja.
Yeah, I have it all the time. I love it, and it smells like my paint box.
And it goes around a lot of things, like journalism and fake news. It goes around, like Ann just said, like this thing about how we otherize people. Yeah. And we view them like this. There's a lot of things happening with cameras and with like recording and sewing scene. It's also about nature. There's a lot of nature in the book, beautifully drawn. And it's, as you said, I can see some relationships to the things we talk about here, like the mutant things we talk about here. Like in this book, there's questions about how the river sees not only aliens, but also a character with a disability that has mobility aid, and that is like very like she's not defining herself by that, and that's pretty great. And that's some of the stuff that we look for when we look at X-Men comics, is like see things that are like, like normalizing things that were not as normalized. And I don't know, I wanna maybe ask you if some of the themes you had in mind some years ago came back in the seeds.
Well, the seeds is definitely based on lifelong obsessions. Definitely the animal rights stories that I did in Daredevil that were maybe too preachy. This, as you learn how to. Comics are really about putting as much of it into the pictures as possible and pulling words out. And so, and as I left comics to be a journalist and a documentary filmmaker, so the scoop comic that's inside the seeds is a lot about my experiences as a journalist. And in terms of like, what do you leave out of a story? And, you could get like all quantum mechanics on it or Heisenberg, principle on it. And, the objective, there's no such thing as objectivity. But, when you're doing a piece of journalism, you leave things out, and that changes the nature of the story. And so I think that David and I very much wanted to have a comic that gave many, many points of view. And one of the most important points of view is the readers. So we created this thing a little bit unconsciously. It's not like David and I said, hey, let's make something really cryptic and so everyone can have their own reading of it. It just sort of happened because we were throwing ideas back and forth, and we were burying a lot and putting a lot into subliminals and foreshadowing, and maybe we went too far and it's just a puzzle no one can figure out, but you can see on the cover, it's like the Minotaur in the cave. I don't know, there are those ancient drawings of the Minotaur in the cave, and you'd have to find him in the maze, and but in terms of normalizing, I think Ruby Falls, which you can see the gorgeous artwork of Flavia Biondi, she's so talented. I think she should be doing tons of, this is the Italian, look at the Italian edition. Oh, we're about to have the seeds come out in Astorbury, the Spanish publisher.
Oh,
so
okay.
That's coming out in March. And so what I wanted to say was in the Seeds, the wheelchair is the Lola in the wheelchair is something David wanted to do. That in the beginning of the comic, you know, I came up with all these different characters, and then I said, you know, you designed them, of course, and and he just wanted to have a character that was physically challenged. And at first it was Astra. She was going to have one leg because, and I had a friend who lost a leg, and it was something I was kind of familiar with. And then for a while we were going to make it the farmer, because the farmer was the one most likely to lose a leg in his work. And then David just gave that to Lola, but we never commented on it because he specifically wanted it to be just normal, not like a big deal. And for Ruby Falls, you know, the central couple, Blair and Lana, are a couple. They're a gay couple, but we don't really make a big deal out of it. Specifically in both these books, that isn't what either story or comic is about, because we wanted it to be just normalized and part of life. And we would love to reach a point in the future where all challenges or others or outsiders or whatever you want to call them is just part of life, part of the landscape of life. So now I'm rambling, sorry.
It's perfect. And also in Ruby Falls, I don't want to spoil Ruby Falls for anyone. It's a mystery story, so anything could be a spoiler. And I don't want to spoil it for people, but there's another queer character in the book that is great, because I feel like it's a really credible part of their story. Like, it's something that makes a lot of sense with how they view their childhood, with how, you know who I'm talking about, but I don't want to like spoil it for the people watching. And and I think it's not only the normalizing part, but it's also that this is a part of their characters that they don't hide. They don't shy away from giving this some perspective or some, when it makes sense, not just because, but when it makes sense, when it has some meaning in the book.
Well, I also wanted to have the 3 generations, because life is, and then you're middle-aged, and then you're old. And so I wanted, especially, you know, the book starts with a secret that is buried in the grandmother's mind. And so you have like, I was trying to capture that sense of Lana wanting to conquer the world, and she's, you know, has to get this mystery out of her grandmother, and she's almost just disrupting her grandmother's mind, and when she really should just leave her grandmother at peace. And she wants to, like, you know, and then her mother is trapped. She ended up in the bar, she's serving drinks, she doesn't like her fate, she doesn't, and it's sort of like, at the middle of your life, you think, is this how did I end up here, and why am I here? And is this really where I intended to end up? You know, and I think that people during this plague year are definitely thinking about these things, because we're all, you know, spend time trapped at home, and you wonder even more, you know, am I where I should be at this point in the road? And when this is all over, should I go on a different road? And so yeah, then one of the reasons for all this is Karen Berger. I mean, Karen Berger really, I told her a story, and she really pushed me to tell the story. And she said, we need Flavia Biondi on this story. So that was you know, the editor fighting for you. And I think also it goes back to Chris and Wheezy and me and the XMen and New Mutants. I mean, you know, we, especially the New Mutants with Bill Sienkiewicz, we had to fight for those stories. You know, we had to fight especially for all the roads Bill wanted to go down. And I think Bill made a significant change to the way people see comics by bringing that expressionistic wildness into the medium. Not that it wasn't going on in underground comics already. It was that he brought it into the mainstream. And now I find that, I came back to comics to do some stuff for DC, Catwoman, and some other books. And it was very obsessive about keeping the characters what they call on model, canon. You could never do a Bill Sienkiewicz style, book today, because it's the IP, the intellectual property is too valuable. They may mine the comics for stories, like you can see with this new WandaVision thing, that it's definitely got the DNA of a Tom King story in it. And Marvel had to let Tom King do a non-canon Vision story. I don't know if your viewers know the story, but he just put the robots in suburbia, or whatever they're called, androids. So, I think the publishers really need to keep letting the artists and writers go a little wild, because those are the future stories. I don't know. I probably don't know what I'm talking about. It's probably a good thing I'm not an editor anymore.
Well, no, I think that's a completely fair point, because when you run the risk of the storytelling becoming bland and homogeneic, and without any sense of risk, when everything has to be safe. You were talking about the beginnings of your career and the most recent work in your career, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but I get the sense that the common thread amongst your many diverse projects is giving a voice to the outsider. And it struck me when you were talking about the art scene in New York in the 80s, and Basquiat, the street artists, all of that. Great, the music scene. Yeah. And I wonder, is that baked into your DNA, or was that a conscious choice on your part?
I think you're right. I think it's baked into my DNA. I was an outsider, so I don't think that I ever felt like it was unnatural to tell maybe stories that were wacky and maybe too wacky sometimes, because I was in that milieu. And everybody was experimenting. The performance artists at the time, you could walk into CBGB's and see like the Talking Heads or Patti Smith, and then walk a few blocks further and go to the Wawa Hut and see Steve Buscemi and Mark Boone Jr. doing like an improv stand-up riff, and then walk another block and one of Jim Jarmusch's films would be playing, and then my friend David Leslie was doing this performance artist where he was a performance artist where he would wrap himself up in bubble wrap and jump off a rooftop. He called himself the Impact Addict, and it was sort of on and on. The scene was so creative, and these were my friends. These were the people we all hung out together. We all went to club, and we were all making art. I made paintings, and then of course the comic stuff. And I remember my friends were all like, "What's this comic book thing you do?" And they were very curious about it, and then I think some of them started buying Daredevil and be like, "This is so cool," like with the street kids and the graffiti and the sensibility that John Romita Jr. and I wanted to put into this sort of documentary feel for Hell's Kitchen. And it was kind of like you would just walk the streets of Manhattan and there would be your next Daredevil story. Like I remember riding the subway packed with people, wondering what they're all thinking, writing down what I thought they were all thinking, and then thinking we're in hell because we're commuting on a subway. What if the train went to hell? And that all went into Daredevil. You know, they all dove down to hell and met Mephisto. So it's kind of like, it was very organic. And like I said, there was no overlords watching too carefully. I had my editor, Ralph Macchio. Chris had me and Wheezy. And yeah, you'd have to slip it past Jim Shooter, but Jim Shooter was really pretty cool about most of the stuff that we were doing. So there was no guardians at the gate between the artists and writers and the readers. So it was like really direct. Now there's like all kinds of committees and planning and, you know, sub-editors and group editors and senior editors, and you have to like go through the corporate.
Sure.
So-
Sure. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say I really like how you was talking about your process, how you like sat and you watched real people and tried to put real emotions. And to me personally, that is the one thing that actually drew me a lot to New Mutants and that era of comics, is because they're characters that feel real. Even when you were talking about your newer stuff where they have these diverse identities, those identities are able to land without feeling two-dimensional because they have that emotional background behind it that kind of fleshes them out and makes them feel real.
Thank you. And I'm sure Chris and Wheezy would thank you. You know, of course we all made goofy missteps back then. You know, I mean, people, I get interviewed a lot now about what was it like to be a female in an all male world, you know, because there was me, there was Wheezy, there was Joe Duffy, and Marie Severin, of course, but there weren't a lot of women, and the comics didn't have, you know, strong female characters except for Chris's books, and if there were a few others, and you know, people are like, so you know, I look back at that time, and I was writing like Punisher, Wolverine, Daredevil, Ghost Rider. I look back and I'm like, why didn't I write more female characters? You know, why didn't I create more strong female characters? And so that's one of the things that I love about Marvel today, with especially the work Santa Eminet did with G. Willow Wilson with the Ms. Marvel, and Kelly Sue DeConnick. I mean, that stuff is just really, like, I look at that and I go, man, why didn't I do that when I was, you know, why didn't I speak for women more? And so it's been amazing to see the more comics written by women. Kelly Thompson is another one, and she lets the hero make mistakes, like really bad mistakes, and you get to see the process of becoming they don't come popped out all powerful, you know. So now I forget what the question was. Sorry.
It's whatever you want it to be. Travis or Brayden, did either of you want to jump in?
I mean, I guess I could say that right now it's a scary time for me because, you know, Ruby Falls and the Seeds, we can't hide behind a superhero cape with those two. You know, it's kind of like, you know, when you write a superhero, to a certain degree, they just sell and they get promoted and they reach people. But David Aja and I, you know, we spent 4 years of our lives making the Seeds, and we don't know if anyone's going to read it. We don't know if it's a crazy piece of work. Is it a good piece of work? So right now we're kind of like, oh my God, what did we put out in the world? You know, and we can't hide behind Batman's cape, you know, for this one. It is what it is. It doesn't have that buttress of the action adventure escalation narrative to hang on. So it's kind of a scary time for us. And we hope you buy the Seeds, everyone, and Ruby Falls. I mean, I think it'll do well in Spain because that's David's country.
Yeah, he's gonna present it in a lot of places on May and so. I know. Okay, if maybe Travis or Braden want to say something before I go, because I have like a lot of other notes, but I don't want to like be the one that asks every question.
I guess something that keeps coming up. I love the way you talk about the stories of your work in the 80s and how you talk about Claremont and Simonson and you as like a package and producing all of these like this well of creativity. Did you have a sense at the time that you were this kind of like X group, this X-Men group, and that you were this like cool group in the Marvel company? Like, did you know what the three of you might one day become in the creative life?
We did not think of ourselves as cool, even like not at all. I mean, I think that each office had their books, and you had, Danny Fingeroth and Jim Salicrup, I think, were like the Spidey books, the Spider-Man books, and then Mark Grunwald and Mike Carlin and they were like the Avengers. Everyone loved their books. Like everyone loved their little group of books. And we definitely never thought of ourselves even remotely cool. I mean, we were nerds. We were just making comics were not cool back then. I mean, we loved it, but it wasn't like, I mean, the X-Men sold really well. And so, I mean, we knew that we were hitting something because the sales kept going up and up and up every time we put out another. And I remember at one point, Chris was like, I want to do a story that's just Storm. And it's an emotional story with her and Forge, and it's a relationship story. And I was like, well, it's a team book. So to do a solo story in a team book was a kind of a risky thing to do. And, but we decided because the X-Men were selling well, oh yeah, there it is, beautiful, that we could take a risk and do a story like that. And, and so we did it. And, it's interesting that we probably wouldn't have done that on a team book if we didn't have the sales. And so it's another thing about risk and the risks you take. I used to keep all the covers up on a wall, and then the sales figures would come in, and I'd write the sales figures because you always wanted to see if the impact the cover had on sales. And it was pretty much, if you had two characters bashing each other, the sales went up. And if you had a passive cover, the sales went way down. And so now I have two books with completely passive covers. But, it was kind of a sad thing to know at the time that we could do those two Storm stories. And we had Barry Windsor Smith, of course. And so the covers were great. But, if you didn't have the fight on the cover, the sales would go down. And that was always very sad. That was like always very reality, like, oh my God, okay, we have to have people fight or they won't sell.
Well, one thing that sticks out when you were saying that is like the cover that Matt picked up, no one's fighting, but it's an iconic story.
Yeah.
And I like the longevity these comics that may not have had the high sales back then would end up having. Like a lot of the comics that we bring up on this show to talk about how their stories are still impactful, it's not about some big all-out brawl that happened. It's about it's about the emotional impact on the characters and risk that you guys took to put them there.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, like David Aha likes to joke, I say, well, Our Seeds is just going to be a little tiny cult book. And he's like, I don't mind if it's a cult book as long as it sells like a blockbuster. And I'm like, I don't know, maybe. But I think that you just have to do what you want to do, put it out there, and hope that your honesty reaches, who it reaches. And I think that was the thing with Chris, was that, he loved those characters so much. They were like, I mean, we talked about them all the time as if they were totally real. You know, oh, but, you know, Rain feels left out now that, you know, Sunspot and Cannonball are doing this. And sometimes we'd be like, you know, we'd realize we'd be talking about these fictional characters as if they were our best friends, and we were like very tender towards them. And I think that that all comes across in Chris's work, how he felt about all those characters. And then even, you know, and then when Bill came on, I mean, when we did stories like the Slumber Party, I mean, that was like, you know, I don't think a single other office at Marvel Comics would have done a team superhero book or mutant book that opened with a slumber party. You know, that was so Chris, Bill, and me. You know.
That's how we talk about those characters too. I feel like I talk about
out as an odd man out from that era. You know, it just was organically part of what you three were building or had built.
Yeah, and I think that the Marvel movies kind of reflect the sensibility of the other offices more. You know, like the Avengers office certainly. The Marvel universe of movies reflects that sensibility a bit more. What the other offices were doing. You know, I haven't seen the new Mutants movie yet. Have any of you seen it?
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, it didn't turn out good?
It needed more slumber parties.
It needed more slumber parties.
I would love if the movie started to reflect that more emotional depth, that more character-driven, organic sense that the original New Mutants did have.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's why, you know, they take from Chris's work, but they don't involve him in the plots, even though they're taking his stories. And the same with Bill. I mean, the sensibility that Bill brought to the New Mutants is probably in the film, but yeah, I haven't seen it yet, but I will see it.
I think it's a shame that I know they can't really afford to take similar risks.
Yeah.
Or to have that kind of energy, but it would be nice.
I mean, I enjoyed Typhoid Mary showing up in what was it, Iron Fist, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you kind of like if you create a character and then there they are in Iron Fist, but then, you know, the Netflix Marvel deal fell apart or something, and so they couldn't finish that storyline. But they had only introduced one of her characters. They had plans to go to introduce all four of her personalities. So I guess, you know, but so it's still thrilling. I'm sure Chris and Bill are thrilled to see Illyana, and especially Illyana. She looks so good, you know, on the screen.
So I want to read you some appreciation comments, because, you know, people are saying nice things, and I want to
that's sweet.
Yeah, Kat, who is a friend of mine, say that you are a legend, and thank you for all your gifts to our imaginations. And that's a great way to put it, to put my feelings, even if she did that. And Astra commented that it's great to know that you all thought about these characters as friends, because that's how a lot of us readers think about them too, as our best friends. And I think that speaks for a lot of us. I think I think about Illyana and Rain as if they were my best friends or something. Probably because I was reading this comic since I was 12, so I just like feel those close to my heart. So those were my comments.
It happens. And I remember when I was writing Daredevil, I used to almost hallucinate that I saw him up on rooftops. I'd walk around like Hell's Kitchen and I'd be like, oh, he's up there, you know? I mean, you really do immerse yourself. It's immersive, the way like an actor immerses themselves in a role. You have to. I mean, writing Daredevil, I I started doing judo. I started doing karate. I started boxing because I wanted to know, what does it feel like to throw a punch? And what does it feel like to be Daredevil? And also, what does it feel like to be Karen? And that was Matt Murdock's girlfriend, and have like your boyfriend Matt come home with blood on his hands. I mean, so you really have to like become like a immersive actor and say, you know. And then of course, when I started boxing, the first time I got hit, I went, "Nah, I don't like getting hit." You know?
You know, not very many people like getting hit.
No.
Can you talk at all about how has your documentary work or your teaching, has it changed how you approach comics?
Yeah. I think that, I mean, I always did want to steal, you know, writing is stealing, it's theft to a certain degree. I always wanted to take what I saw in New York and put it into Daredevil. And I think that, you know, I went and I taught film in Haiti, and I made some films. I made a film in Baluchistan about falcon hunters. And we were talking earlier, I was teaching film in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so, you know, when you make documentary film, you set up your main camera on a character, but then your B camera is always like, what are they doing with their hands? You know, what are they doing with their fingers? What's that smoke over there? And, oh, there's a dog, you know, sniffing its butt or whatever. And you grab all these shots so that later when you're creating a portrait of a character and it's basic Eisenstein, you know, principle of montage, you know, where you say, here's my face, cut to, you know, a bag of pencils, you know, or cut to the snow. And you create emotion through putting shots together. And so for the seeds, the scripts were filled with cut to roosters, cut to ants, cut to mushrooms. You know, there were a lot of shots built in so that we could build the nature's point of view and also constantly embracing the world around and building up what the character is feeling through. You know, David did some of these gorgeous things with just the 9-panel grid, like how, you know, the farmer, one of the farmer scene, he put a tree in the center panel, and then everything coming out makes the page interconnected and embraced. So yeah, I mean, definitely the film teaches your eyes how to think in images and collect images. And like I said, be a good thief. You know, you're stealing life and sticking it in a comic.
I'm wondering, did it work in the other way as well? Were there stuff that you took from working on the comics and kind of brought it into your filmmaking or your other artwork?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I mean, a lot of this is unconscious. So, you know, you write comics for 10 years and then you leave to be a journalist and a filmmaker. I think I still had those storyboard things flickering through my eyes. You know, your eyes become like squares, you know, and you're kind of like the sensibility of God's eye view, ant's eye view, horizontal, you know, panning, you know, with a camera, you pick a beginning and end shot if you want to do a pan. Yeah, I think it all just rolled from one thing to the next. Yeah, so you're both right about both those comments. Yeah.
So since you had a break from writing comics for a time, how did it feel to get back into it eventually? I mean, was it like, I don't know, flexing a muscle you haven't used in a while and kind of awkward, or
it was awkward. I mean, I think that because the 80s, if you want to think of it as like the garage band era of comics, where we just could do whatever we wanted, and including make lots of doofusy mistakes. You know, I mean, I look back at some of the work I did and I go, wow, that was crazy. I don't even know what's going on in those stories, And then, when Bob Harris and Dan DiDio, who asked me to come do some DC comics, and I had just come back from Haiti, and Haiti had a big earthquake, and I was there for like 5 months solid making. We made something like 40 movies, 40 short films, and I mean, I was really shattered from just working so hard and being out because we would shoot, we ran it like a newsroom after the earthquake. We had a tent, and I had like the students would come in and they'd pitch me stories, and I sort of taught them how a newsroom runs, and I'd be like, okay, that's a cool story. And then we would jump on motorcycles with our gear, our booms, our cameras, or jump in the back of a truck, go get the film, bring it back, edit it together. And I mean, it was so hot and so complicated, and you're run out of gas, and then all the gas stations are closed, the internet's down, and I came back kind of like shattered a bit. And then, Bob called me, Bob Harris, and said, because Bob and I were friends at Marvel. He took over the XMen books, and he said, would you like to try one of these new 52 books? And I had no idea what he was talking about. And they kind of explained it to me, like all the DC, and it made sense in principle, because these characters are 60, 70, 80 years old. And so you do want to reset. You do want to go back to their origin and their essence and their younger selves. So he was like, well, Green Arrow isn't the seasoned warrior of the Mike Grell, Denny O'Neil stories. He's like a young, like Elon Musk type or something. And I remember thinking, I think they called him James Bond and Elon Musk or something like that. And I went, okay, I'll try. But it was like the lean, mean Green Arrow was the one I loved. Denny O'Neil was like a mentor. So it felt like rude and kind of awful to, do those Green Arrow stories. But, I'm a team player, and you give me an assignment. I'm a professional, and I just do it. And I love those guys, and I love the characters. And so they kept moving me to, then they moved me to like Catwoman. And I did, and then they said, here, try Katana, here, try, I forget, Clarion. And so we kept trying to do these resets on characters. They were like, Catwoman doesn't know how to steal yet. And I'm like, okay, she doesn't know how to steal yet. So my first few stories were like, she screwed up heists because she didn't know how to steal yet. And yeah, I really loved working with Rafa Sandoval. I don't know if that's how you say his name, Sandoval, but he was just so great to work with. I mean, and I liked his Catwoman was like athletic. Of course she had the good body, but she was really like an athlete's Catwoman with the boots, with the heavy soles, no stilettos. And, we had a lot of fun together, Rafa and I, even though I can't speak Spanish and he couldn't speak English. But I mean, I look at that work, and the Catwoman sold really well. I look at that work and I'm like, I didn't really know what I was doing. And so when Karen called me, now I'm really happy to be back in comics because of Karen Berger, really. These two books. Yeah, Karen is like the best. So
how could you not get hyped when Karen Berger calls you and says, hey, come write things for me? Yeah.
Well, you're never going to get any idiot comments. You're not going to get the idiot stuff that you get. I mean, you're not going to get like, okay, it doesn't matter what you're working on right now. Suddenly, you have to stop your story and put, Croc in the middle of a Katana was like a, I was working with Alex Sanchez, and it was kind of like a return to her sort of Japanese origins, and suddenly we had to stick Killer Croc in the story, and it's so like, okay, I'll do it, but it is a relief to not have those directives coming down from on high. And also the 20-page a month thing is insane. I mean, Rafa could do it, but with the other 3 books I did for DC, there were fill-in artists pretty much every other issue. And, there's no way, I don't understand. I mean, the artists do it, but it's brutal. It's brutal to do the 22 pages every month. It's like making a movie a month.
And are you working on something now? If we can ask that. I don't know if we can ask that.
No, yeah, sure. I mean, I'm drawing. I don't know. I have some of my drawings here. So I don't know what it is yet because they're too buried. I think the drawings are too buried for me to find. But they're I'm drawing in order to find a story. And I have like 3 I'm working on. And one of them I think might be, oh, here's one that's kind of weird. Here's a weird drawing. I don't know how to turn it to the camera, but I just do these drawings and trying to find, I think I would like to do something about Haiti, so I think there's some of the drawings are kind of about characters people I met in Haiti. And then I have another story that I'm working on that's more of a historical story. But I don't know. You have to find something you feel like living with for a long time. So, and then I do my own thumbnails, which I never show to anyone, but I kind of map out the comic to make sure it could be drawn. Because my early days, I gave artists way too much to draw. Like, I think of poor Art Adams with Longshot, it's like, I think I gave him like 12 panel pages,
Is there any stories or any characters that you feel would draw you back into Marvel or X-Men to kind of give up the freedom that you found with your newer work?
No, I could definitely be drawn back in, but I would be like, I would have to really think about the character, come up with a story that I thought really dug deeper into the character. I mean, I wouldn't want to go back to just kind of adventure. Even though I really enjoyed doing that with Rafa and Catwoman. I mean, we had a blast doing that. But I think I would like to do something that would be like, here, take Black Widow or whoever, Poison Ivy, I've always loved her, and do something that really gets deep into who they are. And, hopefully with the same artist for the whole run, because that's another thing that, the fill-in artist thing is really problematic. And I would really like to do the story about Haiti because early days of Daredevil, I did a voodoo story that was so wrong. It was like voodoo as American filmmakers see voodoo. And, in Haiti, going to a lot of, really understanding what voodoo is and going to a lot of voodoo rituals, I look back on that story and I cringe. So I feel like I owe it to Haiti to do a real, to really portray what they're up to, with a little more respect. I mean, we all have stories we look back at and we cringe at the stuff we did, Well,
and Haiti is one of those places in the world that needs its stories told as locally as possible. Yeah,
and it's interesting because working on the film school, it was created by this guy David Bell, and they want to tell comedic stories. A lot of them. It's like when you live somewhere with that many problems and it's that poor and it's that troubled. You know, they have a natural comedic sensibility that comes out of that somehow, that they want to tell funny stories and make each other laugh. You know, during the earthquake, we drove around and brought movies to, I mean, you know, a lot of the tent camps had nothing but mud. And so we would pull in and show movies. And it was funny because we would show serious movies and documentaries. And then we realized that really what everyone wanted to see were like bulldogs on skateboards doing pratfalls. So we ended up showing a lot of that kind of stuff.
I think this what you're saying about Haiti is so amazing. The work you did in Haiti is so amazing. Could you say a little bit more about what involved you in the project there in Haiti?
Well, it was my friend David Bell, and I had gone to visit him in Haiti, and I remember he had bought an abandoned coffee factory, like for nothing, and he took me there, and he had just gotten a phone line. This was pre-internet, and a landline, and he said, "I'm going to start a film school." And I said, "Yeah, right, sure." And he said, "Well, if I start it, will you come down and teach?" And I said, "Sure." And because I had a magazine for, I don't know, 7 years called Scenario, which was a film magazine where I interviewed writers and directors about their screenplays. And basically, it was the original script, the shooting script, the director making the movie, and the editor being sort of the last writer and juggling scenes and crafting, like similar to the way David Aja works, where he would take the scripts I sent him and juggle everything for the rhythm. And so I was getting quite skilled at that kind of work. And then David called me and said, "Okay, I've got, 20 students, come on down." And I went down, and my first class was screenwriting, and then moved into, but basically by necessity, I did some workshops in documentary film, mostly because in Haiti, it's not really a writing culture because, the government doesn't bother to give them good education. And so we developed a method of working that was come up with an idea, workshop it yourself, we all became actors in it, film it, and then write it based on the improv. So we developed a style of filmmaking that worked for Haiti. And then just, every year, sometimes twice a year, I'd go down and teach for a stint, and then was there for the longest, after the earthquake hit. And I think it was because everywhere you look, there was a story to tell. I mean, the whole country was a newsroom with news stories going on. And and I mean, I went deep into the culture because the students, they invited me to all kinds of stuff where I really learned about Haiti's history. It's the only successful slave revolution in the history of the world. And, they have been punished ever since for that. Because, when that revolution happened, America, they were still slave owners, and they I think it was Jefferson, right? Cut a deal with Napoleon, the Louisiana Purchase, to give Haiti its freedom. But, they've been spanked ever since. And that's a real lesson. It's a real history lesson. But like I say these things and it sounds sad, but I mean, I had a blast there. I mean, we had so much fun. It reminded me of pre-internet life because they didn't have internet because the government didn't give them enough electricity. So we were always out in the street. They're always out in the street making music and playing soccer. And I mean, it was extraordinary. And I think that's a lot of what the zone is in the Seeds, is a craving to get lost in the world without the iPhone and the computer and the drones and the surveillance and the tracking and all that stuff. So I think that impulse became the Zone B in Seeds.
Okay, so we got a comment that was a question. I'm gonna try to frame it as kind of last question or something like that, as something like, where would you see the characters that you edited and wrote back in the X-Men going back to the stuff? Where would you see them now? Where would you like to see them now? Something like that. Ask it someone.
You mean the New Mutants and the X-Men?
New Mutants and the X-Men, yeah.
Well, it's weird because I don't read what's going on in the books now, and in fact, I would if anybody said read this, I would read it because I think it's just too much. There's too many books, so I don't. I would have to be directed to something good. Like somebody told me to buy The Vision, and that's how I know about The Vision, because then I really loved that book because it was like. So there just seems to be too many of them. I think is that if someone said, Annie, go buy this one, you'll love it, I would go get it and read it.
I mean, I think
you like.
I think I could speak for at least Gabriel and I on X Factor right now. The new X Factor is going very strongly, and I would also recommend the new Mutants. Especially what is starting now with Vita Ayala writing.
So who is writing?
Oh, in the X Factor is Leah Williams, and with David Valdeon in art.
Oh, okay.
And in New Mutants is right now is passing to Vita Ayala, which I think would be a great starting point when they start.
Say that
and Road Race.
Vita Ayala. And they only have written 2 issues so far. So
okay.
Yeah,
I'll try those. I mean, because I love those characters and I'd love to read them again. But every time I pick up one of the books, I just don't know what's going on, which I'm sure is how people felt when they picked up the X-Men when I was editing the book. They don't know what's going on. So I'm guilty of like getting lost in the, multi-part thing. But then I do recognize that it's really difficult even to be about it.
So Duna was absolutely right that she's speaking for me with those recommendations. I think that both Williams and Ayala are doing that kind of stuff that you spoke about liking, with the deep emotional aspect of the characters. Williams is doing interesting stuff with the concept of abuse and trauma over in X Factor, and she's really taking those risks there. And Ayala is also doing interesting work in New Mutants in regards to things like agency and the stuff. And they're also taking risks with the stories they're telling over in that title.
Oh, well, that's great. I'll look at that. I mean, it's interesting that I always think of Typhoid Mary as her origin is an abuse origin, because it's based on, when a woman or a man experiences a trauma, how you separate to. It happened to that other person, not me. And so that was the original split with Mary and Typhoid, and then Bloody Mary. And it's, but I never had the courage to focus on that part of her story. I was always like, well, the Flash, and the kind of like the, the cool, sexy, let's destroy Daredevil part. But, it's great to hear that people are actually getting into the real nitty gritty of that stuff. So thanks for those recommendations. I'll look them up.
Okay, so that was really nice to hear. And okay, so thank you everyone for watching. I mean, if anyone has anything more to say, I just don't want you to go on a rush.
Because I have a. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just briefly wanted to thank you for spending some time with us on your Saturday, and thank you for all of the contributions that you've.
Thank you, thank you for your essay. I really loved that piece. Everyone should look up his Typhoid essay.
Thank you from the heart For
Thank
real.
you. Thank you all. Great to meet you.
Thank you.
You are welcome back anytime.
Okay, sure.
Anytime.
Bye.
So
It was such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I sadly have to hop off to go to the next one, which is strangely, it's somebody dissecting one issue of Longshot.
oh,
Cool.
Yeah, issue 3, and it's odd because I didn't remember issue 3, and I pulled it out, and it's a suicide story.
I just read it. Yeah, it is.
And I'm just like, oh my God, this is so relevant because I have so many young friends who are really suffering being quarantined. And so I'm like, I don't want to get too depressing on this podcast, but I really want to say, if you know anyone in isolation, call them now, reach out. So, I'm sure that's not what they want me talking about on a Longshot podcast, but I'm going to do it anyway.
go ahead.
That's important.
Wonderful.
It's important
Yeah,
to talk about.
absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.